A quick question for you all. Do you recognize this game? Because I kind of feel like you should. Like we all should. Is it Tekken? DOA? A crappy Soul Calibur knockoff? Well, unless you were a big fan of fighting games during the early polygonal years, you probably have no idea what this game is. In fact, odds are that based on what I'm showing you right now, you're already losing interest. Another by-the-book fighter of the era that just popped up and immediately died, like all the other wannabes that couldn't make the cut. And while there is some definite truth to that, I'm actually kind of surprised this game isn't more well known. Hell, you might have even played it and just don't remember. Because, just like a hipster at Starbucks, what you're seeing now just blends in oh so well. But here, allow me to refresh your memory. Don't be wary, my friends. Your eyes are not deceiving you. Long before Cloud took up arms in Smash, or the heroes and villains of Final Fantasy duked it out in Dissidia, there was a little known game that held the mantle of the Final Fantasy fighter. Ehrgeiz, Energizer? Jeez, maybe part of the reason the game faded away is because no one can actually say its name. Ehrgeiz, God bless the ring. At least I think that's how it's pronounced. But either way, it was the first time Final Fantasy fans could answer those age-old who would win in a fight questions that we internet dwellers just love. Cloud vs. Zack, Vincent vs. Sephiroth, Tifa vs. Yuffie, and of course, the big one itself, the one bout that everyone has always wanted to see, Yuffie vs. Red 13. Oh yeah! Just popping the game in starts us off with the obligatory 3D cutscene, depicting the characters doing stuff that is in no way represented in the actual game, which was the norm for that era. But just like my opening montage, you'll notice that the cutscene is missing something, the game's claim to fame. But don't worry, skipping past that will take you to the game's other claim to fame, being the first DVD menu in a PlayStation game, years before the built-in DVD player of the PS2. Bravo, game. Bravo. Doesn't seem to be reading. Maybe it's early Blu-ray? You know what? I'm not gonna lie, I'm a little disappointed that nothing actually happened when I did that. But seriously, I have to bring this up because it's just so jarring. The screen kinda just appears, and it's hard to process how this was even okayed. And really, let's break this down, shall we? Up here is the game. You know, the main attraction, the reason we're all here. But it just looks like the real title screen was just jammed into a tiny box and just shoved in the corner. Bad game. You sit in the corner and think about what you've done. And it's sad because the same size box is used for the other features too, including selecting the memory card. Great use of space there, guys. Great use. But wait, what's that taking up the other half of the screen? Well, down here we've got mini games, which definitely don't deserve this much space, as they suck. They include a button mashing race on the beach, a NASCAR race on foot, an endurance mode for the fighting game, which personally I don't really consider a minigame, but here it is, and this absurd tic-tac-toe knockoff. And honestly, that's all the time I'm going to waste on these, because again, they suck. Just skip them. But let us not forget about that final corner. What is it, you ask? Why, it's a brand new quest. And also, it's the point when the game manages to completely derail from what we're here for. And guess what? We're gonna do the same. Just like any opening band, we gotta endure this before we can get to the main event. But the question is it a star in the making, or should we send it back to the garage? So, a brand new quest. You see that? And already I know what you're thinking. A story mode, right? Maybe something akin to Conquest Mode in Soul Calibur 2? But no, not even close. It's basically an entirely different game altogether. So it's almost like you're getting a second game for free. What a deal, right? I mean, it's just like that time my doctor told me I have brain cancer, with an extra helping of colon cancer on the house. Joyous me! You can never have too much cancer. I mean, Ehrgeiz. Cancer. Okay. So what exactly is the extra quest? Well, basically, it's a dungeon crawler that took the crawling aspect way too far. You play as these two characterless characters as they attempt to find a magic sword embedded with materia, which is the same sword you're trying to get in the fighting game, by the way. And yeah, I did say materia. This magic sword is an all-powerful, name-dropping MacGuffin who, with a sole purpose of, I don't know, justifying why the Final Fantasy characters are even here? I mean, it hardly seems to matter, though the flavor text says that with it you can become a god, or even blank. Which begs the question, what's beyond a god? A super god?
I shall henceforth be known as Super Kami.
But who really cares? The game clearly doesn't, so why should I? Well, anyway, the extra quest begins with our two archaeologists traveling through two of the fighting game stages until they're knocked out by the loading screen. Pansies. Where afterwards they awaken in this generic hillside town, a luxurious resort where none of the buildings could be bothered to have any signs labeling them, and the NPCs spew out nothing but massive tutorials that are supposed to pass as dialogue. And this is kind of why I brought up the title screen earlier. The interface really sucks, in both the ugly and uninformative ways. More on that second part in a bit. But now that we've read all that engaging information, and I really do recommend reading it in order to figure out some of the more perplexing mechanics, it's time to enter the dungeon. And from this point on, the game's pretty straightforward. Work your way through 21 floors until you win. To the game's credit, the floors are randomly generated per playthrough, making each adventure unique-ish. You know, about as unique as the same repeating rooms can really get. But honestly, that's kind of the best thing I could find to say about this mode. Which, ironically, is pretty meaningless for me because I don't ever intend to play this mode again. But you never know, I did kind of say the same thing back when I was 10. I remember that the first thing Chibi-me did when I got here was hop down into the well nearest to the game's starting point. That automatically took me to floor 12, where I immediately got wrecked by a giant squid. Oh, but don't worry, I showed it by shutting the game off and never playing it again until now. That'll teach it. But seriously, all jokes aside, everything about the extra quest is a trog, and it feels like it was just included in order to pad out the game. For example, despite there being two playable characters, only one goes into the dungeon at a time, despite the opening cutscene clearly having them go in together. The problem with this is that you pretty much have to continually backtrack to town in order to switch between the two, which is pretty essential, as it's the only way to restore your health and hunger, unless you want to waste items. It's also important to keep both characters leveled up. If one character dies, it's up to the other character to venture into the dungeon to save them, and more importantly, your loot. But even that's a chore because switching between your characters unequips everything, every single time. Add in the constrictive and lousy inventory setup, and just a ton of other small issues, it just really begins to pile up. Fast. And the really unforgivable thing here is that these issues weren't even a problem back in the original Final Fantasy on the Nintendo. SquareSoft. That being said though, I'm not beyond looking over a multitude of problems if the core gameplay is at least enjoyable. Pity it's not. Like I said before, this is a dungeon crawler in its most basic form. You go from room to room hammering the attack or magic button until either your enemies are dead or you are. But it's never satisfying. It's just the same XXX combo over and over again, with just minor variations related to the type of weapon you have equipped. And if that wasn't bad enough, the enemies actually managed to be cheap as well. In nearly every other room you enter, a trap will be activated, summoning a new horde of monsters via lightning bolt. As if God himself is trying to kill you so you'll stop playing this crap. And of course, the freshly spawned enemies are invincible for a few moments. And boy oh boy do they like getting those cheap shots in. Dying in this mode is a real issue too. I guess that in order to attempt to keep you from saving too frequently, which I would imagine is to prevent players from just using one character instead of switching characters by just, reloading your game, they actually made it so that saving costs gil. Yeah, gil, another FF7 reference. And as your level goes up, so does the cost of saving. Early on, I had managed to bring down the first boss and decided that it was time to call it a night. But oops.
Not enough cash, stranger.
And ended up having to grind for an extra hour and a half just so I could quit. Which is usually the reverse of the problem I have, where I know I need to shut the game off and be a responsible adult, but maybe just one more level? But not here. How did they manage to screw this up so bad? I can just see it now. Hey, whip us up an RPG we could just toss in there to appease the Final Fantasy fans so we don't have to hear them moaning about this being a fighter or them expecting something else. That should appease them. And yeah, then they threw this shoddy half-assed padding in as quickly as they possibly could to appease the masses. But I'll be fair, the game does attempt to have some deeper mechanics, if you're really willing to invest. But personally speaking, it feels like I'm playing RPG grinding the game. It's just dull. I managed to get more than halfway through before my data corrupted, and I could just not bring myself to do it again. Nearly 8 hours of just going back and forth between the same dungeon? Just no. This mode was a waste of resources and a waste of time. Which is a real travesty, as I think all that extra time and effort could have, and should have, been used to improve the actual main game. Which isn't to say there weren't improvements at all. I'm just saying that there should have been more. Because for better or worse, Ehrgeiz is a pretty faithful port of its arcade counterpart, with only 2 major changes of note. One good, and one not so much. Let's talk positives first. Arguably, the best thing to come from making the leap from the arcade to the console has to be the expanded roster. I remember back to my days of my youth when the arcades were still flourishing, and by flourishing I mean the one at my local mall was still up and running long past the heyday of arcades. Rest in peace, Jolly Time. I miss you. I was scouring through the games trying to decide what I wanted to play next, when a huge yet familiar sword caught my eye. As you can imagine, it was the Buster Sword, being wielded by the one and only Cloud, in a fighting game no less. So I immediately had to play it. And then I had to play it again, as Tifa. So the addition of more characters like Sephiroth, Vincent, and Yuffie is a definite plus for a Final Fantasy fan like myself. And it's not just them. A few other original characters were added to the mix as well, including the duo from the Extra Quest. Though, I can see anyone actually missing that due to the lack of information. It's odd. The game completely fails to announce or even really adjust to the inclusion of new characters. No new challenger approaching or anything like that. They kinda just appear in the select screen as you scroll, which by the layout you might not even realize until you pass them. And they're really not integrated into the arcade mode either, thus causing each playthrough to be very repetitive with the same opponents in the same order each time, regardless of who you play as. I also had to make a complaint about the final boss. The final boss is basically Red 13 from FF7, but it's a frustrating fight as only low attacks can really hit him. And an extra challenge for the final boss would be fine, but after you beat him during the credits, you fight another final boss. Though you don't actually have to beat this one. But he's the monster guarding the magic sword, so why would I not want to beat him? But the only way to do that is to break these blocks, which I never really figured out a reliable way to do. And after you do that, you have to hit him with the swords inside, and then collect some coins, all before the clock runs out, without dying. It's a drag. In fact, the overall single player experience here is pretty lacking in both the campaign and features all around. But, as we all know, fighting games are truly about that mano-a-mano skill-based action. Cloud only, no items, final destination. And you know what? That comparison isn't too far off the mark. Don't let appearances deceive you. Ehrgeiz may look similar to other fighting games of that era, being published by Namco doesn't help break that mold, but Ehrgeiz actually has a lot more in common with Super Smash Bros. Than it does with, say, Tekken or Soul Calibur, in how it attempts to break away from the norm. Unlike many of the more traditional fighters, both players aren't forced to basically face each other in a confined area trading blows, but are instead in a much larger arena where they can run around freely, even jumping up and down from different ledges depending on the stage. Ehrgeiz actually plays a lot like how Super Smash Bros. Would probably play if it had been full 3D as opposed to 2.5D. Compounding on the comparisons as well, aside from the cameos, is the button commands. Being able to run around the stage for dodging, attacking, and, well, running away means that more complex combo moves like quarter circle forward are out, and that one button moves are in. It's a setup that definitely favors button mashing to be sure, but techniques like teching and intercepts do add a semblance of skill to the mix, though probably not enough. Now, just a disclaimer, I'm about as good at fighting games as McDonald's is at serving health food. Now, I've played my fair share of them, and I really like them. I've even played regularly against tournament goers, by the by, the results of which wouldn't have been any different if I had just placed my controller on the ground and bent over. But my point is that I'm probably not the best judge at gauging the balance and competitive merit of a game. But you know who is? The fighting game community. And just think about it, there is a reason why some series still persist, why some games, despite being decades old, are still played competitively. They've survived the test of time. And think about this for just one moment. Square is still making Final Fantasy games, somehow, and Namco is still producing multiple fighting games. Yet the combination of the two, with the added fanfare no less, couldn't keep this game afloat. Company-hosted tournaments couldn't keep it ticking, and even being put into Square's Millennium Collection couldn't keep this game from falling off the radar. And if I had to take a guess for the reasoning for this, it's probably due to the lack of depth and some issues with the controls. Neither of these are very easy to explain, especially for someone who isn't that deep into the fighting scene like myself. But I think the quickest way to explain it is this. It's just too simple. Referencing Smash again, it's kinda like playing that for the first time. Seemingly basic, until you start to realize the deeper mechanics. Except, that second part never really comes. There's definitely a solid fighting game buried in here for those willing to take the extra time to figure it all out, but it's more often overshadowed by its favoring of button mashing and projectile spamming. Something, by the way, that does not bode well with the pros. And the problem with the controls? Well, if you've ever played a third-person action game, say The Legend of Zelda or Kingdom Hearts, then you know why games like that have a lock-on option. This doesn't have that, but instead has a semi-automatic one that kind of makes it harder to land hits, hone in on your opponent, or even freely run around, making the controls more of a hindrance than a help. And it really hurts the combat by making the movement much stiffer than it should be and considerably less reliable, taking away from that all too important skill factor. And speaking of unreliable, screw the special moves. Many of the specials are some variation of a homing projectile, but half the time they just do whatever they please, often missing parts of their multi-hit moves, which is just another nail in the coffin for the whole skill department. So with all that in mind, Ehrgeiz, is it worth picking up? It's really not worth the effort, but not because it's bad. While flawed, Ehrgeiz was a moderately enjoyable fighter for its time. The graphics, the music, and the sound effects all still hold up, while the graphics being particularly good, for the era, and Square really did make the best looking stuff of that time. Also, the sound effects themselves have a fun, arcadey punch that you really just don't hear too often anymore. And personally, I'd be remiss if I didn't say that I enjoy hearing the FF battle music. The game overall tilts more towards a party game style fighter, more so than it probably intended. It tried to break away from the standard formula and do something different, but as history has shown, it wasn't done well enough to leave a mark. The tacked on minigames are a joke, and the RPG is probably one of the worst dungeon crawlers that I've ever played, making mistakes that games in the 8-bit era didn't even make. But what really seals it for Ehrgeiz is that it's become completely obsolete. While it's still a fun throwback and a pretty decent game overall, for fighting game fans, not RPG fans mind you, Ehrgeiz's biggest downfall is really that it's become obsolete. Many truly great fighters still remain mainstays of competition, long after their predecessors have surpassed them. But Ehrgeiz remains dormant to all but the most nostalgic, because what made it stand out from the crowd is gone. For fighting game veterans, Ehrgeiz is a solid, if not shallow, fighter of the era. If you're looking into it, I highly recommend bringing along a group of friends, particularly serious fighting game fans, because the single player experience has absolutely no meat to it and gets boring pretty fast. RPG fans who are roped in by the lore of Final Fantasy should probably look elsewhere. The Final Fantasy characters that helped carry this game have gone on to star in their own spin-offs or cameo in other, much better fighters. But if you're still looking at Ehrgeiz with interest, I'd recommend the Final Fantasy Dissidia series on the PSP. With its open 3D environments, fast-paced movement, and focus on the Final Fantasy universe, it's a natural progression of the style. A pseudo-sequel, if you will. I'd also recommend the Power Stone series, another similarly angled fighter that captures more of the party aspect of the Smash series and is also 4-playered. Fun. And of course, obviously, any hardcore fighting fan should already know what competitive games to turn to for their one-on-one fix, but I'd probably go with the Soul Calibur series for the closest comparison. Anyone else still looking to pick up Ehrgeiz should really only bother if they're an avid Final Fantasy collector and really just want to be able to say that they own this small footnote in the Final Fantasy legacy. But for everyone else, give it a pass.